My parents were both Harvard professors.
I didn't know
Father,
that.
who was tenured here and left here to become the chief human resources officer at General Motors Corporation in the 70s. So, as a child, when my mother would teach in executive programs for women here, I was babysat by the wife of the dean of the Harvard Business School at the dean's house.
Amazing.
So, I grew up around this place.
Hello and welcome everybody to another fantastic episode of EDU Unlocked with me, Ashish Fernando. Our job at this podcast is to meet with inspirational leaders and help you understand what does it take beyond having a job at an institution to actually help the institution grow, to help the economy grow, and most importantly, to make a difference in every student's lives. And joining us today is one such amazing and inspirational leader. I am really privileged to have you on our podcast, Joseph Fuller. Welcome.
Well, Ashish, I'm delighted to be with you and your audience.
This intro can go on forever if I have to because of all the work Joe has done in his life. I'm gonna give you, the audience, a glimpse of who Joe is. So he is currently a professor of management practice at Harvard Business School, out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Of course, everybody knows. He also co-leads the Managing the Future of Work project at Harvard, and he has a lot of interest and a lot of work and hard work that he puts into everything about future of work and the workforce. Really focuses on employment dynamics, workforce development, and just evolving ways of working with AI and everything coming in. Um, Joe goes a long way. I mean, you started back in what, 1983, like early 80s?
In 1983, I became the first employee and one of the co-founders of a management consultancy called Monitor Group, which was largely a function of work that we'd done here at HBS in the area of business strategy. One of my co-founders was the famous strategist, Professor Mike Porter, with whom I'd worked for a number of years prior to starting the firm. And uh, I left that firm about 12, 13 years ago to join the faculty here. It's now called Monitor Deloitte. It was acquired by the uh, actually the world's largest consulting firm, Deloitte, about a year or two after I joined the Harvard faculty.
It's amazing. And I definitely want to talk to you about how it was building a company working with Michael Porter. I mean, we read all your books, his books, and all the things that you all have done together. So I want to get to that. But I want to definitely also, before we get started with our questions, help the audience understand what more you do. I mean, other than Harvard, you're also on the board at multiple organizations. You're on the board of trustees at Western Governors University, very workforce skill focused institution. So I'm sure a lot of your brain power and expertise is getting used there. You're on the board of directors of the PVH Corporation. I'd love to know a little bit more about that too. But you're helping organizations beyond just the work you're doing at Harvard, and you take a lot of a lot of happiness for you comes from helping these other large organizations.
Once you've been an entrepreneur and built a company, you find out that your transmission is kind of stuck in fifth gear. So you don't have a way to slow down and begin to work a more glacial work pace. So as you mentioned, I founded and co-lead the Managing the Future of Work project. We also, uh, I was asked by our then president, Larry Bacow, to chair a university-wide committee here at Harvard about how we at the university level ought to think about issues of employment, upward mobility, skills development. And that eventually led to the founding of another project, which I co-lead with the very distinguished labor economist David Deming at the Kennedy School of Government here at Harvard, called the Project on Workforce, that focuses on really uh, entry level work, younger workers, looks at issues of education to employment transitions, career navigation, skills development. David is doing some remarkably innovative work in what we call the skills lab, where we're actually trying to understand how young adults and mature adults learn new skills, not just the value of those skills, but how they're actually acquired.
Yeah.
So really primary research, and then a number of companies that I work with on these issues and some other business relationships you talked about. I am the chairman of the board of trustees at Western Governors, which is a great privilege. I'm very proud of the good work that we've done, and we recently gave graduated our 400,000th student, and we
Yeah.
have about 180,000 students enrolled today. So I think in many ways that's the work I find most fulfilling, trying to help that great management team continue to pursue their mandate, improve outcomes for students, and create people who are on a path to employment, because Western Governors is an organization that only teaches through a competency-based approach. So if you're in our School of Technology or Education or Health or Business, all your advancement hinges on being able to demonstrate to us that you've really mastered the material, as opposed to you've attended a certain number of class hours or what so many other online universities do. So
Yeah.
a full plate, and I wouldn't have it any other way.
Yeah, and even with that full plate, somehow you're finding time to also do the podcast. I mean, you've done what, like over 400 episodes?
Well, I think it's closer to three. I do it in
Yeah.
conjunction with the co-head of our project, Managing the Future of Work, Professor Bill Kerr here at HBS. So we split that burden. But we've been downloaded now more than 1.5 million times, and uh, I understand the challenges of doing a good podcast, Ashish. Delighted to be on yours, but it's a medium that really is has become integral to lives of people that have interests, like your listeners, that they are they have multiple hours in the day. For me, it's a pretty brief commute to work, but
Hmm.
my dog loves podcasts, because if I start one I'm enjoying, I just keep walking, and she's delighted.
That's
And
amazing.
it also allows people. It's a great medium because people can find focused material of a sophisticated nature, which is hard to get in broad journals or and we've all been trained to learn both visually and through auditory sense. So this is a relief from picking up yet another um,
Yeah.
NPER paper. I've got several here I've got to read this weekend.
Okay.
So it's a great it's been great fun, and we've been able to welcome guests who are I've learned a lot from, which is also
Wow.
very gratifying.
Yeah, yes, and I feel it. Just like, when I interview you on the podcast, it's just amazing to learn from people like yourselves and be able to ask you the questions that most people want to ask you, right? Because a lot of people in higher ed want to learn from leadership, and I don't know if there's a lot of avenues for them to do so. That's one of the reasons I started the podcast is to help them get a little bit of insight into the lives of people like yourselves. So I'll start there. I mean, there's a lot you're doing. There's a lot you've been doing for the last 40 plus years. Um, what does hustle mean to you?
Well, I think it means really being disciplined about pursuing things, and pursuing them with vigor. The uh, If any of my former colleagues happen to listen to the podcast, they will be unsurprised to hear me say, if you're not in a hurry to get where you're going, or in a hurry to start take doing the work you've signed up for, have you made good decisions?
Hmm.
Why are you going to a place you don't really want to get to? Why did you take on some work you're really not excited to do? Um, I think also what I've learned, particularly since I've joined the faculty about 12 years ago, is that in this area of skills attainment, uh, career pathways, education to employment transitions, one of the essential attributes it has is that it's a multidisciplinary issue. You can't really understand employment outcomes in the United States just through the lens of labor economics or just through the lens of
Yeah.
education or just through the lens
Mhm.
of sociology. Um, and so it takes a lot of effort because you have to have a very broad network of people you can collaborate with, whose judgment you can call on, but also you have to be prepared to study some topics which aren't familiar and look for ways to draw connections between them. And that requires a lot of vigor.
Yeah.
And and as my colleagues in our two projects will tell you, um, I'm a great one for saying yes to the next interesting thing before we've finished the things we've already signed up for. So that requires us all. I'm afraid I therefore by transitivity force my colleagues to hustle at a pretty vigorous rate too.
Oh yeah. Oh, okay. Yes, I absolutely get how that goes, and I face a lot of that even within my organization when I feel like, oh, we have a couple of hours and we can start another business or do something like, and not everybody is aligned on day one because not everybody sees the future 5, 10 years out, like what change you're making right now, working that extra hour, doing that hustle. So it's amazing to see that. How do you manage family while you're doing that?
Of course, my family is grown now.
Yeah.
We I have three sons and now happily four grandchildren, two of whom
Wow.
arrived just this summer. Um,
Wow, congratulations.
as a a founder CEO in a professional services firm that rapidly became global, of course, our my family was a normal thing in our family was for me to be away several nights a week.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, I think families develop routines and norms and hopefully healthy, happy practices when everyone kind of knows what to expect. Uh, but having, raising children when they're young, where you're ever present, and then suddenly changing to a role where you're away half the year is a very hard transition to impose on them. My children grew up with it wasn't unusual for me to be in London or in Hong Kong or in Sao Paulo. As they got to high school, it meant I carried copies of some of their textbooks with me, which made my carry-on heavier. But if they needed some help on something, I could look at the same page and all being pre lots of PDFs.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
Free internet.
I'm also blessed that my wife and I knew each other in high school, started dating in college, so she knew what type of personality type I am, and
Yeah.
she's also had a distinguished career. She's currently the mayor of the city we live in, and prior to that was a city councilor. So she hasn't been sitting at home hoping I come home from the office early. In fact, I've spent a lot of the last 10 years waiting for her to get home and uh,
What an irony.
walking the dog, as I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, talk about power couples. That's fantastic. I did read about her in through the bio. I got through some links. It's just tremendous what you both have been able to achieve while raising children. That's amazing. So coming to your work now, in the little time we have, I want to keep the questions very focused and specific to the work you're doing. I mean, a lot of people talk about future work and what they think institutions need to change and employers need to change in order to make that skill gap less prominent. You talk about the hidden worker a lot in your articles and whatever you write, talk about. So and you talk about the fact that hidden workers are overlooked. So give us a little context of what that means, and is there a way to unhide?
Well, just to prevent anyone from being making incorrect assumption, we use that phrase to describe workers who are effectively screened off from the view of a potential employer. They're hidden from the view of an employer.
Yeah,
And that happens due to a couple of factors working in tandem. The first is that all large employers, really much, really in all the developed world now, but certainly in the US, although we've done the work in the United Kingdom and Germany as well, rely on automated systems called applicant tracking systems to post job opportunities, receive submissions from applicants, and evaluate those submissions. And
yeah,
all of these applicant tracking systems, which are, very sophisticated in terms of their design and user friendliness, allow the employer to upload a job description and to instruct the ATS, the so-called ATS, on things like, um, are you willing to accept an applicant who has been arrested, who has a felony conviction? What's the minimum number of years of experience you expect? Is a degree required, or a certificate, or a license required? And many of the filters are even more extreme than just a very specific credential. So,
mm-hmm.
for example, there's one called the continuity of employment filter that says, if someone has a gap on their resume of more than 6 months, how should they be treated? And all these filters were adjusted, and the potential employer is asked to, should this be a filtering consideration or a ranking consideration? Filtering consideration means, let's take an easy
Yeah,
one. Do you have to have a college degree to be considered for this job? Yes, no. If it's
yeah.
yes, a non-degree holder is just automatically dropped from
Excluded.
consideration
Yeah,
on that basis alone.
yeah,
Ranking means rank this lower than other people that have a college degree, but don't eliminate them solely on this basis.
yeah.
Now, for a large company, companies interview 1% or so of the number of people who actually go through this process. So if you're ranked lower, you're probably out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that causes a lot of people who have a lot of attributes that the employer would find appealing to be screened out of consideration because they failed on one or more of these considerations. And that in turn allows the employer to get a very, very curated, narrow list of applicants,
Mm-hmm.
but exclude a lot of people that might really have an appealing profile, except for one blemish or one shortcoming. And if it's something like 2 years of experience, but I'm requiring three, or like my wife, they had a gap in their work history of more than 6 months because our first kids were twins,
Oh, wow.
and so
Okay.
she was on bed rest for and out of the workforce for more than a year. That those employers could be creating a shortage of highly qualified candidates in the effort to really have a very small number of people they have to invest time in who match this often overly designed set of specifications.
Understood. Yeah, and and I'm glad you clarified how you define them. I was also, when I was reading about hidden workers and what you've written about them, I've always been with some of the work we do with clients around skills and workforce. I've always been trying to find a way to get people who are not on your typical LinkedIn, Indeed, and these job search platforms, but have the skills. They don't know that the skills that they've put together from different little, certificate courses or any little work they've done, maybe a job they've done that gave them some skills, all of that put together is actually a really good skill set for a better job. But there's no way for them to A, get that information, and B, find that job because they're not on LinkedIn, they're nowhere, and apply. And like for me, like that's a different type of a hidden worker who's there out there who can apply to that job. And I always try to find ways to get them to, like when we're working with WGU on some of the things that they're doing with skills gap and understanding, is how do you make that match happen, right? I wonder if you have any thoughts on that or any work that you're doing there.
Yes, we one of the things that many of your listeners will be familiar with is the problem posed by the lack of a coherent shared taxonomy about skills in the United States.
Yeah.
And there are roughly 170,000 words in the Oxford English Dictionary, and there are 4 million different jobs, job descriptions, skills, degree types, certifications in the United States. So it's a hugely overly complicated system, and we don't have some of the disciplining mechanisms that they have in some European economies, of course,
Mm-hmm.
which many of which, especially in the German speaking area, have grown up around very big, robust, and high market share apprenticeship systems. So it's what we're trying to do is uh, do several things. The first is to cause employers to be aware of this phenomena and to be understanding that often the shortage of candidates they complain about is a direct short function of the fact that they've set such high bars on multiple fronts that there many people view it as a hurdles race. The person that ran the best time knocked over a hurdle,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore you don't know they were the fastest runner because when they knocked over the hurdle, they were disqualified.
Disqualified. Mm-hmm.
That how do we move to create a common syntax or to create tools? And here, generative AI is going to be the unlock. How do we create tools that rationalize that so an employer can not only look at their incumbent workforce and get a much better sense of what kind of skills inventory they have and what they lack. You can look at companies like Gloat, for example, that have excellent tools on that, or increasingly some very advanced tools that allow people not just to look at their employees, but candidates. Also look, for example, at what other companies in their space are looking at and having their job descriptions. You've got very sophisticated companies like Tech Wolf,
Mm-hmm.
uh, which is a Belgian-based company, but they are really building a uh, very high-grade set of capabilities in these domains. So I think it's beginning to sink in with employers. Um, it's certainly something the U.S. military is familiar with, that the military taxonomy doesn't port very well into civilian life. And if there's one common thing with veterans, it's a very particular about not saying they did things they didn't actually do. So they tend to hold fast to the military taxonomy, even though they're saying I was a
Mm-hmm.
staff sergeant in Air Force Repair Depot. They don't say I was a supervisor in a technical repair operation, which is the job they're applying for, but it's not what they did. So they don't say that, even though it would that be a great pre-qualification for consideration for such a job. So we're not going to get beyond some of these inefficiencies without that, but I'm really confident now we're beginning to see growth on the AI front that will allow forward-looking companies to make a lot of progress on that in the next 3 to 5 years.
Love it. Thank you for that insight. A couple of things in terms of now that we're segueing into how jobs are going to be. You do talk about gig work, and there's two things I'd like to combine together into one question. Is uh, Gig work is a big. I mean, I get a lot of work done on Fiverr. People who are doing small projects, and some
Mhm.
of them are really good at it.
Yeah.
And also the whole shift from the work from office model to a hybrid. I mean, we went to a work from home model to now a hybrid model that most companies are deploying. How do you think the future is going to be with respect to both of those things, right? Do you think of it being a gig economy going forward? Is, hey, there's no 40 hours that you're doing the same thing, like you're doing based on what skills you have, how much time you want to give to a certain job, and then what's the flexibility around it? Do you want to go to work or not, to office? Yeah.
Well, I think we're heading gradually, if a little bit indirectly, and kind of in not the as the flow crow flies course, but a little bit of a
Hmm.
winding course toward large companies having a a wider variety of working relationships with talent, which they figured out how to administer. Large companies are generally are set up to employ someone full or part time, and they're further set up to accommodate vendors workers. The vendor could be Kelly Services or Randstad, or it could be someone from do through a gig platform like Upwork or Catalent, but they're not set up to have, for let's say, a seasonal worker unless they're in agribusiness or construction. What do I mean by a seasonal worker?
Hmm.
A worker, for example, who might, through their employment relationships, not work between June 1 and September 15th. And that's part of their employment understanding because they're 70 years old and they have a house on Cape Cod or a house in the hills of the Berkshires here in Massachusetts. And um, to keep that person employed and productive, the employer has made a more customized design for them.
Hmm. Yeah.
I think rather than have those two or three standard relationships, we'll gradually have eight or 10. Why do we need that? Workforce demographics in the United States are not robust. And the way we get jobs filled is to remove barriers for staying employed with the skilled people we do have. So that requires saying something other than them. Here's our normal 9 to 5, 48 weeks a year, full-time job. That will still attract lots of people. But if you're going to move workforce participation with women over 70%, or you're going to bend the continuing declining curve, and very alarmingly, by the way, a declining curve for young men,
Hmm.
18 to 34, where their workforce participation rate is lower materially than it was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
We're going to have to understand what's keeping them out of work and how we can toggle working relationships and expectations to open opportunities for them to fill jobs and work we need to get done.
Yeah. Do
Uh,
you get worried about that 18 to 34 demographic where,
very,
yeah.
very. That population, for those of you who are interested, I would commend the research of my friend Richard Reeves, formerly of the Brookings Institution and now at the American Institute for Men and Boys, um, on this topic. Real authority, and his writings are very insightful.
Mm.
But he shows us a couple of things that are very profound. One is we have a number of young men who get into working age and they're a bit lost and they don't They haven't had the type of role models as teachers or coaches or parents that would inspire them. They may make a false start on something. To bridge back into my research, if you're if you're well into your 20s and haven't created some kind of coherence to where you're headed, you've worked at a quick service restaurant, you've worked a season of construction, you've been out of the workforce for 5 months, um, then you worked at retail. That ATS system we mentioned earlier, it
Hmm.
doesn't make sense of who you are relative to other people seeking the job who've been working steadily in that type of position, gaining skills and gaining credentials and gaining years of experience. And you get locked in to high turnover, low wage positions, which are not that economically attractive. So if I can rely on my parents, 20% of that population that I mentioned still live with their parents. That's a historic high, and the same number for women is 12%, a lower percentage, where historically women of that age still living with their parents historically used to be much higher than men.
Yeah.
So major concern, particularly given this, if they're not acquiring skills of that era, what are they going to do in their 30s, 40s, 50s
Yeah.
that will sustain them?
Yeah, absolutely. And something that we look at all the time with data is the going back to the hustle, right? Like, a decade or two ago, I mean, in your when you're in your 20s, like the hustle culture was way different than how it is now, right? Now it's about, hey, can I find pockets of work where I can do things like that, work for 4 months, make enough money for the rest of the 4 months, and I don't even have to own a home. I don't have to have a stable job. Yeah, I want to do gigs. That it's very interesting, the dynamic there. And then on top of that, all the automation with AI that's gonna also, in some ways, it'll create jobs, but in many ways, it will also take away some of those small gig jobs. Right?
Yep.
Yeah, it's
Especially in
wild.
routine cognitive work, we'd say. Um,
Yeah.
and it's easy for a conversation to start focusing on interesting and new developments, but there's too much focus paid on uh, highly educated white collar gig work, coders, SQL black belt whose SQL is who's spends 1 month doing a gig in Paris and then goes to Milan and then goes to Hong Kong. That's a tiny number of people.
Yeah.
You know, it's makes for good reading. Maybe good listening on a podcast, but less than 60% of uh, more than 60% rather of today's 18-year-olds will not get a 4-year degree. We can see the declining rolling numbers, very alarming for educators and for those of us who think about the long-term health of the workforce. Um, uh, Only about 40% of jobs could really be work from home, even in the pandemic. We had the so-called essential workers. And one of the great things about gig is that not only does it provide opportunity for people to earn more, it provides that at all levels of income.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a
Yeah.
fairly basic worker, you may you have an opportunity now to drive Uber or DoorDash or Instacart. If you're a, let's say, an assistant store manager for a quick service restaurant, but your hobby is master carpentry, you can get on a gig platform like Handy and get
Yeah.
gig work doing something you love and are good at. Um, right up to, we found multiple instances during the pandemic when there were high skilled tech workers who had two full-time jobs
Mm.
and neither
Yeah.
employer knew
Knew
the other one
about.
existed. So, and the opportunity for let people make choices. I was driven the other day in an Uber. I started chatting to the driver, and he had a job, worked for an insurance company, but he has a little girl who is loves to figure skate and is very wants to be a competitive figure skater, and to be able to afford the best coach he could, he was adding work hours through Uber.
Yeah.
And people often, by the way, think that most gig workers are somehow being economically compelled to do it. Generally, most pieces of analysis and research in this shown 70-75% of them are very happy doing it and very happy the opportunity is available. And very few, less than 15%, are relying on things like rideshare as their principal source of income.
So interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in higher ed, I was just at a conference in Boston, in fact, this week for the Pi Live, and
Yep.
I met some people who were doing sales for some ed tech companies, and they were at the booth, and I knew them from before, and this, and I was just chatting with them, and they very casually said, "Yeah, we're doing this job right now. We do sales in ed tech and all of that, and then I also drive Uber." And I'm like, okay, I know they get paid decently well. Like, it's not that they have to drive Uber, but it's that additional income. They have some time, they can make some extra money. Maybe that pays for, a quick holiday every few months. Why not? I think that's how people have started thinking about gig work. Like, yeah, and I totally relate to that, what you're saying.
What we see in corporate settings, by the way, and this is a bridge to your question about hybrid work.
Yeah.
Our research on gig work showed that one of the principal impediments to bigger adoption of gig talent inside larger companies is that no thought had been given to training managers as to how they managed a team that relied on gig workers in important roles. And that
Mm.
those managers showed up and had the misapprehension that basically they could use the exact same approach to running, let's say, a project, even though two people had never worked for the company before and were never going to be physically present because they're gig workers and they live in California or Singapore or Bangladesh or wherever.
Yeah.
And that failure meant the projects often had some problems which were misattributed to the fact, oh, we don't get good work from gig workers. It wasn't the gig workers that underperformed, it was the managers. And it's not because the managers were hostile, it's just that no one had ever thought it through. So
Yeah.
they just tried to do what they do. We see the exact same thing in hybrid.
Mm.
Hybrid, as all your listeners will be aware, a number of large companies have been beginning to say we're really going to reduce the amount of remote or hybrid work, or right down to we basically want everyone to be here.
Yeah.
And when we look at that, a number of these companies are very sophisticated companies that will have looked at the data carefully. A company like Amazon does not make choices like this lightly, and they're a very data-rich environment in their decision making. But the same phenomena of when everyone was working from home and the entire white collar workforce, people who could work from home, had an adrenaline surge that lasted 14 months, companies got by.
Mm.
And I think I know here my employer, the speed at which they moved and the effectiveness of what they did was incredibly impressive.
Yeah. Oh,
Um,
yeah. I read some stories about how they managed everything during COVID, especially on the international student side. Yeah.
International students, uh, they're here at the Harvard Business School. We have roughly 2,000 MBAs and roughly 250 faculty, which probably means that faculty accounted for 80% of the problems in delivering remote work and complaining about remote work, but still it got done.
Yeah.
As we move back to a more normal work status, we lose the adrenaline surge. But also, what's happened is the same phenomena. Managers didn't grow up running projects with highly, variable attendance, with having to have all the face-to-face things occur in 1 or 2 days. And in the meantime, a lot of those white collar workers either had caregiving obligations or developed habits or work patterns that did not include the old return to 9 to 5.
Mm.
And so one group changed while the other is trying to revert, and the that's causing a lot of clash. Uh, and
Right.
and I don't believe uh, it's kind of cynical hypotheses that employers are trying to drive people to quit so they can reduce their costs.
No.
I haven't. I've talked to a lot of these people. That hasn't been mentioned once.
Yeah.
Um, I do believe though that it hasn't been probably given a fair test, because between a management shortcomings and a failure to adjust processes sufficiently to reflect the permanency or of people being out of the office some of the week, that we're getting false negative results in a number of
Fair
instances.
point. And a lot of times when people see, oh yeah, like Amazon laid off whatever, 5, 10,000 people, the typical thought and notion is that it's cost cutting for whatever reason, right? But there's so much that goes into that decision. I mean, it's also it's like hard times call for call for hard decisions. It's also the time to see who's as an employee who's being beneficial to the firm, who's actually doing the work that they're supposed to, and not doing a second gig somewhere else outside looking at productivity. There's so much that goes into that decision. So, yeah. But in the little time I have, I do want to also ask you about your mindset. Like you started the Monitor Group and so successful. You did it with Michael Porter. Um, you switched into academia from being an entrepreneur outside. How was that transition? And you've been here for a bit now, so I assume that you're very happy with how it's going for you. But tell us how you made that shift, because as an entrepreneur, like when I think, I'm like, okay, when can I start my next company? What can I do next? And academia has a lot of benefits, but it's very different from running a company outside. So talk to us about
It
that.
certainly is. My path, um, strangely started and will likely end at Harvard Business School. My parents were both Harvard professors,
Yeah.
including my
Wow. I didn't know
father,
that.
who was tenured here and left here to become the chief human resources officer at General Motors Corporation in the 70s. So, as a child, when my mother would teach in executive programs for women here, I was babysat by the wife of the dean of the Harvard Business School at the dean's house.
Amazing.
So I grew up around this place. And
Yeah.
then
Wow.
I as a undergraduate, I became the research assistant to an unknown assistant professor, Mike Porter. And then I went directly to this school. At the end of my program, I was approached about staying to get a PhD. I elected to leave to work with several uh, colleagues, including Mike, to launch our firm. But the firm was a very intellectual, conceptual firm and had many good connections with faculty here.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, the famous economist and organizational theorist Mike Jensen
Of course.
left Harvard Business School to join Monitor. Chris
Amazing.
Argyris, the
Incredible.
famous behavioralist, was a board member at Monitor. So there
Yeah.
were multiple people we stayed in touch with here. Um, my course, finding my way here, took a couple of twists and turns, but um, our then dean, Nithin Noria, was very um, entrepreneurial in some ways in talking me into it, and it's turned out to
Okay.
be, she's one of the best decisions I've ever made, um, because they've been wonderful to me, letting me pursue interests, push into areas of research that the school had not pursued before, focus on practitioner oriented work as opposed to scholarly papers. And of course, it's a richly endowed not just with traditional resources, research budget, infrastructure. Baker Library is the defining business library in the world, but also richly
Yeah.
endowed with wonderful faculty and great students, as well as a very large executive education program, which attracts top talent. So, as an ecosystem to think about a broad set of issues like the evolution of work, the role of how organizations need to evolve. We can see it now with how difficult it is for traditionally managed organizations to realize the value in AI because they're not well configured to
Yeah.
do the things necessary to unlock that value. It's really close to ground zero for trying to understand those issues. And Harvard is blessed, arguably more so than any other school. I mean, there are certainly schools like the University of Texas, which would have a claim to this. But Harvard's unusual is we have an elite level graduate school in every topic.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
It's pretty
it's
tremendous.
not, you take a magnificent university like uh, uh, Princeton, they don't have a law school, they don't have a business
Right.
school, they don't have a school of education.
Yeah.
Um, so as we try to build more of these so-called one Harvard initiatives, where we're getting scholars like sociologists, elite, you know, hugely accomplished, youngish labor economists like a David Deming I mentioned, like my colleague here at Harvard Business School, Rafaela Sadoun, who has um, done incredible work about reskilling and upskilling in companies. You get to be in an environment which is so provocative and so welcoming to someone that is addressing topics that decision makers actually care about. So it's been a great platform, and it couldn't have been any more welcoming, or couldn't have exceeded my expectations any better.
I love it. I mean, you say it with so much energy and zest, and I'm sure you've been asked this question so many times, but I can feel it. I mean, I think it for you, it started with family. You had successful parents, and then Harvard was kind of, it seems like it's your sacred place. I mean, you've been there
Uh,
since you were really young. Uh,
I look quite a bit like my father did.
yeah.
I'm happy
Okay.
to say I have more hair than he had at my age, um, but occasionally I've appeared in the alumni magazine, and alumnus from many years ago, usually well into their 80s, will occasionally write me, and one said very amusingly, I saw this article about this work on workforce. My father's dissertation was on labor relations and primarily taught in our organizational behavior faculty. Um, and this gentleman wrote me and said, I saw, a picture in the Harvard Business School magazine. And I said, my God, Professor Fuller is still teaching. How could that be? And then I read the caption and I saw, so you must be his son. Uh, and uh, unfortunately, while I do look like him, I'm not half the teacher he was. He was a great, great, great teacher. So I'm sure that I would be, ranked well below him if I had to compete with him for students.
I mean, that's your humility, and yeah, I'm sure. I mean, you're same if not better, and he's proud of you
Well,
in terms of the work you're doing. That's
he would be.
amazing.
He's long deceased, of course, but
Yeah,
he'd be proud of me. But there's not a I owed his chance that I'm as good as he was teaching wise.
it's amazing. We're almost at time, but it begs to ask the question because you've done so much of work on future work, and you understand the intricacies around it. What are your sort of, I mean, it's cliche when I say bold predictions, but like if you were to see a decade out from
Mhm.
here, in terms of the critical skills that will stick, especially when, kind of machines are taking over or whatever. And what will be your prediction of how the future of work will be with all that we've spoken, right? Gig and this and that.
Samuel Goldwyn, the great movie mogul, said he never made predictions about especially about the future. But I think that I'm going to talk, if I may, Ashish, to
Hmm.
the notion of what are better companies and institutions going to do.
Hmm.
The first is they're going to understand at a deep and detailed level how their employees define a good job. I'm doing some very significant research on that topic now, and what you see is companies have a very limited and stylized understanding what people actually seek in a job, and therefore create turnover or uh, situations where people won't accept an offer due to being unaware of why, as opposed to it's just a mismatch. We're going to see a hugely more efficient market for labor because one of the things that constipates that market today is the quality and accessibility and accuracy and timeliness of information on everybody's part. What is the employer looking for? What's the match with me? What does Ashish have to offer? What's the match with what I need? Um, companies will and better good policymakers will understand, and this may happen sooner than people think. We need to fundamentally rethink the way we go about immigration.
Hmm.
With a We have to stop effectively deporting people that we put through the world's best system of higher education. We need more skills based um, immigration, maybe longer residency periods for citizenship. Um, we have to be very cautious about how quickly we slam the door on certain forms of immigration. I think um, uncontrolled immigration of lesser skilled workers doesn't,
Yeah.
after a point, help the economy. It and something we have to understand, and this is it's often audiences go very quiet when I start talking about this. An economy doesn't cease growing, and companies don't cease their strategy simply because they can't get workers that can do certain things when they need them.
Hmm.
They go to the next best alternative. So,
That's
illustration of that
right.
would be the massive IT services industry in India was created was there were not nearly enough software engineers in the United States.
True.
Uh,
100%.
and the quite a lot of industry in the United States started going global because a unit of labor in the United States got so globally uncompetitively on cost. And also, people looked, were there pipelines of people coming into professions to replace that post war generation? There weren't. So, to know about the next 10 years, you have to know about things like are there big policy changes?
Transition.
Are there
Yeah.
um, one final thing I'll just say
Very
is,
true.
I believe contrary to some of my, uh, I would call them peers, although many of them are more distinguished than I am, people that study this topic, there's a growing skepticism that generative AI is as important as we thought it was
Uh-huh.
because the
Yeah.
adoption rate is low. I
Right.
completely reject that. I think
Okay.
it's just flat out wrong. Uh, Generative
Yeah.
AI and the development of multi-layered agents, which is what we're going to see next, is the most important development for certainly economic organizations since controllable electricity. The
Wow.
thing
Yeah.
that's holding
Profound.
this up is companies can't manage the transition. And
Yes.
everything that's happening is about incentives and metrics in companies. I'm championing my inner Mike Jensen here as a close collaborator of Mike. It's about structures in businesses. It's about risk aversion in businesses. It's about the inadequacy in the quality of support available for companies
Mm-hmm.
and in the quality of the resources they have that currently contain their data.
Yeah.
When we start getting native AI, native hybrid remote or remote work companies, it's going to be a very exciting period. And you
Yeah.
don't want to be old co that was hugely cautious and took everything in baby steps and wakes up with the equivalent of NVIDIA today versus Intel.
Yeah.
And if you don't
Yeah.
believe me, where did OpenAI come from? It's an example of it.
That is true. That is true. Yeah, that is so profound. And being a proponent of AI and LLMs and the kind of things that I'm doing at iSchool, I cannot agree more. That's I feel it's the future. I agree with everything you said in terms of the adoption rate and why it's slow. I feel part of that is also just the understanding, the skill set. I mean, AI in general is not something we fully understand, just like we don't even understand our own brains fully yet, how we store information. And right, so it's been for me a tremendous journey over the last 4 or 5 years, just spearheading a team that's working on AI in education. For me, both of these are topics that are very close to heart. I'm a technologist who came into education. And so, for me, I not just see the power of AI, but I'm also continuously thinking about how to deploy it in the one vertical where technology adoption is typically the slowest.
Yes. Well, it's going to solve many economic challenges for institutions of higher ed. It's going to create remarkable opportunities. I think if just looking at what's happening at Khan Academy with Sal Khan, our graduate, uh, the opportunity to finally start reversing the wasting disease that's affecting so many K through 12 systems in the United States. Um, now, what we need to teach and train will shift. We'll need to start consciously developing social skills in young people since technical skills will be less and less of what employers are looking for. We're
Yeah,
going to have to um, uh, create ways for students to harness the AI without being able to set aside the need to learn, because they're relying on the AI to express learning they don't possess. Um, but I mean, at WGU, we recently absorbed Craft, which is a experientially based learning system supported by considerable asynchronous learning to certify teachers in the United States. Often their enrollees are people that work in a school district, maybe as a teacher's assistant or an administrator, but they have not completed their degree or have not completed their teacher certification. We can do that now by a mix of harnessing experts and making them available to shape the curriculum, having them do webinars, I'm talking master teachers,
Mm, mm.
and a rigorous curriculum that is compatible with and integrated with credit for experientially based working in the classroom. WGU has a similar program. We're the largest graduator of registered nurses with a bachelor's in science degree, a so-called BSRN. That requires practicum. We have studios where people go and work in hospitals and with patients as well as with technology. So we're at a cusp of a change in experiential learning, more social skills learning, more ability to do the type of real-time evaluation. I mean, what Sal is doing in terms of both teaching the teacher what their students seem to generally not know that's already been passed in the syllabus, but also direct a student, identify what the student doesn't understand about this geometry problem or this principle of writing in English. We're going to get mass customization education. And a
Amazing.
lot
Yeah,
of
it's
dullest work for teachers and TAs and administrators, super, off the charts level of opportunity to improve effectiveness and productivity through AI. So the whole system should take a giant leap forward if it isn't too busy looking in the rearview mirror, which is my concern.
I am of the same opinion and of the same, I would say, hope as you have. People like Sal are just inspirations to me. I mean, I listen to him speak sometimes. I've met him a couple of times. Just amazing. Just selfless in terms of, how he wants to push the buck forward. I love it.
Well, he's going to be on our
Um,
podcast soon, so keep listening.
Oh, okay. Oh, he's gonna be soon. Okay, awesome. Yeah. Well, I'm sure he'll be proud of just coming back to do a podcast with someone at Harvard. That's awesome. Good. But this is Joe. This has been great. I have so many questions, especially immigration. Like we could double click on that and do a 1 hour podcast on the value of people coming from outside to help the workforce and
It's
assist. And
America
yeah,
has got such a
yeah,
number of unfair advantages, and our capacity as a society to absorb large, spicy meals of immigrants is something we should not doubt. And
yeah.
we can get a lot of talent infused in this country, and we'll all benefit from it.
Yeah, yeah, and totally get it. And places like Boston, I mean, all of the education put together in Boston supports so much of skilled immigrant students who come in. I was there. I went to Bentley to do my MBA. And because it was a 10-month MBA, I was like, wow,
Absolutely.
opportunity cost.
Great example of one of the several uh, outstanding institutions of higher learning we have in Boston that don't enjoy you know the the global reputations of a Harvard or an MIT, but they're just their light is blocked out a little bit by the big
Sure.
bonfire, the vanities on the Charles River. But
Yeah.
you know, a Bentley, a Babson, Northeastern, which is a magnificent pedagogical model and
Yeah.
terrifically effective. I have to mention Boston College because my wife is the mayor of the city. It largely rests in, so I don't want to cause trouble for her. My friends at Boston University, Tufts. I mean, it's an embarrassment of riches.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean, it's you're so right. It's amazing. And I saw when I went to Bentley, I had a Yale MBA, and I chose Bentley because it was a 10-month MBA. They gave me a full ride,
Oh,
and
bravo!
so it was an offer I couldn't resist. And
I hope you're paying it forward and an active donor.
100%.
Great,
Yes.
good for you.
Also supporting kids in India with learning. Yeah, yeah, definitely something I care deeply about. It changed my life. Got me my first job, my first employer, my first investor. my girlfriend, who's now my wife. I owe a lot to Bentley,
Sounds it.
and
You ought
so
to
I
be
give back.
talking about building a building or something with that behind
Yeah, at some point, yeah. But Joe, thank you so much. This has
you. My
been a
pleasure.
fantastic podcast. And thank you to all our listeners for tuning in today with Joe Fuller, who is an amazing personality, a professor at Harvard, someone who works on the future of work and an entrepreneur at heart, but also such a humble and honest person. It has been a pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you, Joe.
Pleasure is mine, Ashish. Thank you.
Thank you very much.